Welcome to Choose the Bear, a podcast for people living single and or child-free, or who are just curious about a life built on independence, intention, and joy. Because being single and child-free isn't a phase, it's a path. I'm your host, Kat Calvin. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone. So today's guest is Jeremy Ney. He was actually on. We did a little joint interview for my nonprofit newsletter. And he was talking about and what he writes in his Substack American Inequality is so interesting that I knew I had to have him on this podcast. American Inequality writes all sorts of different articles about different sort of data about America and economics and inequality, etc., but in a very interesting way. But he has this two-parter that are linked in the show notes. The first is why maternal mortality is better in America than you think, and the second is why is it worse, and really worse worldwide. And not to be too clickbaity, but the answer will shock you. This conversation really reminded me of one of our early episodes. I think it was like episode 3 or 4 with Karen Leong, in which we were talking about gender-based violence in Australia and what it looks like there particularly, but then we also talked a bit about worldwide. And gender-based violence, of course, is a very big reason that many women, me included, it's high on the list of why we would choose the bear, right? Why we choose to be single. And this conversation, this information that Jeremy dug up and wrote about maternal mortality was one of those moments where you're shocked but not surprised. It answered a lot of questions. It told a really interesting story. It's definitely something that I think you will learn a lot from and hopefully share with someone who you think might gain something from this information as well. So I hope you enjoy. Well, hello, everyone. I am having sort of a second conversation with this guest. I will link in the show notes. We did a bit of a joint interview for my nonprofit, and which was awesome. But then I was like, oh, wait, I need to have 2 more hours of conversation. I have so many other things to talk about. You got to come on the other podcast. And he very graciously did. So I'm here with the very, very bright Jeremy Ney of the American Inequality Substack, which if you are one of the 4 people on earth who aren't subscribed to this thing, you should be. I'll let Jeremy talk a bit about the Substack in general as we get started, but he particularly did a 2-part series on maternal mortality, which is something we've talked a little bit about on this podcast, but I read both of the articles he wrote and was like, okay, now we have to have a deep dive conversation because there's so much in here that is so fascinating. And not only is it critically important just in general, but I think when we are talking about women choosing to be child-free and what the reasons are behind them, that maternal mortality is a thing that comes up a lot. And there are things I think that we're getting wrong and things that we are not even paying attention to, as Jeremy will discuss. But first, hello, Jeremy. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Hi, Kat. Thanks so much for having me back. And yeah, excited to dig into a bunch of these topics.
Me too. But first, can you just tell everyone all about who you are and a little bit about American Inequality in general?
Of course. So I am the author of the American Inequality Substack, which is a newsletter that looks at inequality in America through data analytics and data visualization. We create a lot of maps on where different communities are struggling across a range of issues: healthcare, housing, education, taxes, you name it. And the visualization and data analytics part is really to help us understand which parts of the U.S., are most struggling, with different issues, because, what is happening in, Oklahoma will not be what's happening in California, and even, northern Texas and southern Texas, can be experiencing really different, realities. And so Write quite a bit about this. I'm also, a professor at Columbia Business School. I had previously worked at the, Federal Reserve in New York here, where I now live, which is where a lot of this work on inequality and opportunity started. And I am also working on a forthcoming book about opportunity and inequality in the US, which will touch on many of these issues, healthcare, housing, education, incomes, employment, but also the role that, data plays and stories of those people play in helping us understand what's happening in the country.
Well, we will definitely, I say, if there's anyone other than me, I will definitely have the back on when your book comes out, which I'm really excited about. I'm glad, and we just were talking about this a little before we started. I'm so glad that you pointed out that the situation, sort of economically and in every other way, is so vastly different for people wherever they live. I'm lucky enough to have been into all 50 states and have lived all over, and it's everything from climate to education. We really are 50 countries, and literally even just the ecology. I'm living right now in the high desert in southern Arizona, and I took a master gardener class here, and it was localized just for this area because an hour north in Tucson, it's a completely different climate,
Right.
and that goes for everything else. And so I think that one of the things that I really like about your Substack is that you take that into account. You don't paint sort of America as one picture, but you're like, no, here's how things are very different. And that also is one of the big reasons that we have some of the misconceptions about maternal mortality that we do. So to get started, though, can you talk a little bit just about what sort of define maternal mortality and sort of talk about what it is generally?
Yes, so maternal mortality in the US basically describes and is kind of data that the US tracks on whether pregnant women die in the lead up to childbirth, during childbirth, or typically in the 6 weeks after childbirth. This is, something that has been, tracked by the CDC for decades now. And they have, traditionally left that up to the states, basically, to help them kind of gather that information, funnel it up, to the, federal organization to kind of report on this. And, it's obviously, a really important measure of, our healthcare system, this vulnerable population, right? The US very much so was not, always tracking this information, in large part because like we chose not to ask, like we just didn't, want to know what the, rates were. The current US maternal mortality rate is 20 per every 100,000, 20 deaths per every 100,000, which basically puts the US, in line with Iran and Lebanon globally. So we have, really poor maternal mortality, rates, and among the worst, of, high income developed countries.
But let's talk about that because the part one of your maternal mortalities series is titled "Why U.S. Maternal Mortality is Better Than You Think." So, can you talk a little bit about where that 20 per 100,000 comes from and so, how they get that information from doctors, and then talk a little bit about why you wrote that actually those numbers may not actually be the case.
Yeah, so as I started working on this piece, I kind of, started with like, what is the history of, how we actually go about collecting this data? And it was 1999, the CDC basically added this, checkbox on death certificates asking, was, the person, pregnant, or was this during childbirth, or had they recently given birth, and started rolling that out to different states. And states basically kind of in this phased manner over many different years started adopting this checkbox. The issue was that the states asked that question in many different ways. And there wasn't really a lot of kind of uniformity about how states were interpreting that information. Or that question, and people, doctors, as well as, morticians weren't really clear about like how to fill that out. By it took about 20 years or so for all states to adopt it. But because that kind of data collection was so bad, from 2007 to 2017, the CDC actually stopped publishing that data because there was so much confusion amongst the states on how they were doing it. And so the reason that I kind of wrote this article that the data is actually better than we think is because some, fairly, clever researchers basically went past that simple, yes, no checkbox. And they looked at the actual language that was written in those death reports to basically figure out some additional detail about what was going on with that death of that pregnant woman, and was it actually related to the pregnancy. One of the big ones that the researchers talk about is if a woman is, pregnant or just had a kid, but gets into a car accident and dies, like, would you count that as a maternal mortality death or not? Right? If it occurs in the 6 weeks afterwards on her way to the hospital, like, it's kind of this nebulous area. But as the researchers argue, it actually ought not to be counted as a maternal mortality death because the death had nothing to do with, giving birth, or raising a child or sort of the depression for that. And when you looked at this additional text instead of just this like yes, no checkbox, you actually see that the maternal mortality rate in the US is closer to 10 per every 100,000. It's not that 20. And that really puts the US much more so in line with other high income developed nations, Canada, UK, France. And so that level deeper and trying to like clear up that data, looking at that text actually shows that the US is in perhaps better standing than that, scary, headline number might be.
So, is the CDC looking at all at how they can adapt the way that they are collecting this data to perhaps, because you've said, that even their estimates for that they put out in February of 22, that the rates had spiked to 34 deaths, but that you can't see that in the data. So, like, it seems like it's clear that the CDC still hasn't fixed this mechanism. Is there any evidence that they're planning on addressing this?
Yeah, so the CDC has publicly acknowledged that there are challenges that they are experiencing kind of like with this data accuracy, of maternal mortality, trying to get the states in line. They've run many different training programs. They go out to a lot of conferences to talk about this. They're working on, speaking more with doctors across different states to make sure that there is better alignment here. And so they are, kind of engaging on this, push to, create better alignment. But another area as well where they like, there's still some debate about whether or not they are, going to push further into this is what about all the maternal mortality deaths that happen after that 6 week window? So roughly, external, researchers have found that maternal mortality deaths basically occur in three different chunks. There is kind of the chunk that happens, in the, kind of during pregnancy, right? Basically, you are in the hospital and, that's kind of the main one that we generally think about with maternal mortality. There's some complication, a woman bleeds out, it's, horrific and doctors can't save her. The other third then happens in those 6 weeks, afterwards. You might have heart complications that got undiagnosed and, you end up having some, heart issue. But then there's this full other 1/3 that happens from 6 weeks to 1 year that the CDC does not count at all. There are 37 states that basically track that information, but because not all states do, and the CDC doesn't ask for it, there's this whole 1/3 of maternal mortality deaths that we are just not acknowledging really either. And so there are parts as well where like the numbers go down when you count it in some ways, but they go up when you kind of include, these other, time frames as well.
That done globally? Are there global standards for is everybody counting 6 weeks, or are we all sort of counting different things and comparing? Is there any sort of global standard for how we look at this?
I'm actually not quite sure what the global standard is for this. Like, I imagine, some, countries are like much better. I would imagine many European countries, the Nordic countries are probably much better for this. But there are some countries that really just like aren't yet still tracking this like in a systematic way too. And so I'd say there isn't like a, here is best practice for how to do it. I think in the US though, there are states that are, much more rigorous, that provide more guidance around the questions, that are looking over these longer time horizons. But yeah, it's not like, oh, we can say that Germany is the gold standard of, maternal mortality data, for example.
You're looking at this and really looking at data in the States generally and comparing it to other countries. How much of a difference does it make that we are so massive? I mean, we're the third most populous country in the world. And also that we're essentially broken up into like 50 different states with different governments. And so tracking data across the US is more challenging than, for instance, tracking it across Norway, right? So how different, or what impact do you think that has on our ability to gather accurate data consistently, and to be able to at all compare it to much smaller countries for which this is less of a challenge?
Yeah, it's definitely a huge issue. I think, right, the resources that, some states have to, capture this information, right? Like it can be, hard enough to get enough, doctors into Louisiana and Alabama to make sure that these women aren't struggling, let alone like the, healthcare data scientists who can kind of like help format and put this, in the right, perspective. And then there's like this, I don't know, challenging like reality that we might have about the two sides of this, right? Which is on one hand, it's really painful to acknowledge that you have all of these horrible deaths occurring, right? Louisiana and Alabama, again, are two of the worst states, for maternal mortality deaths. The death rates, there are, 3 to 4 times higher than they are in California. And so just reporting out those measures, like you don't want to be one of those leading states when it comes to this, right? And so capturing that information, there might not be an incentive necessarily for you to, show that as highly. But on the other hand, the better data that you track, the more that you expose this issue, the more likely you are to get state funding, federal funding, support to the hospitals that need it. And so that call for help is a very vulnerable thing for public health officials and doctors to make. But without the data and the willingness to like actually share about how bad things really are, the squeaky wheel wouldn't get the grease.
Yeah, absolutely. What's the demographic breakdown of this? Who is seeing the worst maternal mortality, who's seeing the least, and what are some of the reasons behind that?
Yeah, so Black women are 3.5 times more likely, to die during childbirth or shortly afterwards compared to white women. Native Americans, can be, up to, 6 times, higher, particularly during COVID. We were seeing, rates of like 120, per 100,000, right? So well above, the 20 per 100,000, or even during COVID, I think it got up to 37 per 100,000. So those rates are much higher. The US really also almost started tracking, Native American maternal mortality rates much later, than we were doing here too. But yeah, the risk for Black women is far higher. And, unfortunately, in the US, race and income are highly correlated. So we also end up seeing much more elevated risks for low income women, maybe who weren't, getting sufficient care during, their, entire pregnancy, weren't aware of health risks that they had, and then come into the hospital, and find themselves with, in much more, much worse health conditions.
Yeah. So let's switch over. Well, so now the problem, of course, is whenever you say any numbers around maternal mortality, I'm like, is that a CDC number? Should I trust it? What do you think? Like, if my first thought is, well, now we know they're wrong. So I don't know, maybe it's not 120, maybe it was only 85, right? Like, so like what do you do when you're looking at numbers from a source that you know isn't accurate, but is also the only source? Do you just put an asterisk in your brain?
Yeah, I think I put an asterisk and I'm like, this is, and I will start off by saying that in my work, I, kind of work with an incredible amount of government agencies, pulling data from them, in their data portals, trying to find out, different trends and things like that. The CDC is by far and away one of the best government agencies, that I, work with here. I think COVID, was a real inflection point for them in figuring out how to produce, great detailed geographic real-time data on this. And so I want to start off by saying that, like, by and large, I think that the CDC is doing great work. And I think it was also like a big step for them to even acknowledge that, like, the data wasn't 100% accurate. Like,
Yeah.
I think there are other government agencies that will not make that claim. They're like, we are the truth tellers. We know what is right. And we want to tell you that there is no, pollution in our, in Flint, Michigan, or something like that.
Right.
Um, but I do think, yeah, it is helpful, like, directionally. I think for some of these, data sets too, like the CDC does, listen to, when researchers and universities give them other ways to, produce this too. And so I think that that is quite helpful. But that was sort of how I ended up basically coming to this second article, which is like why US maternal mortality is worse than you think, because I was like, so what is right and what is wrong about this? Like, what's counted, what's not counted? Like, what are these numbers? Because I had that moment, I'm like, what can I even trust? Like, how do I get to the source of this? And so the more one digs, the more, like, yeah, one kind of finds that there are all these other challenges that you didn't even realize.
Well, and I mean, perfect segue. Let's dig right into part two, which is both horrifying and why so many of us hashtag choose the bear, because these stats are pretty awful. So tell us, why is US maternal mortality worse than we think?
When I started this piece, I really believed that. And the picture that I had in my head was that maternal mortality is like a woman giving birth and she dies in the hospital. Like, that is just what happens. It feels like a scene from a movie or something. And maybe that was why I saw it in my mind so many times. But the more I dug, the more I actually found out that that is not the case at all. That is really not what maternal mortality looks like in the US. And in fact, the number one cause of maternal mortality in America is homicides. More women are much more likely to die at the hand of their violent partner than they are to bleed out in a hospital room or to, die from a complication, 6 weeks after, giving birth. It is so much more common for a person to die from homicide, who were pregnant than any other cause. For women who are under 25 when they are pregnant, the odds, of death by homicide double. Um, by some measures, that number, that 20 per 100,000 rate would rise to 25 per 100,000, if this were included in those rates. But we just don't track that. We log it, as a homicide. We don't log it as a maternal mortality death. And so the rates would be, it's like on one hand, like, oh, the death in a car accident for a pregnant woman shouldn't be counted. But if we did count these homicide deaths, the number would tick way back up again.
I'm This is one of those shocked but not surprised moments. Like when I clicked on the link and I was like, oh yeah, of course, that would be the case. Because we just need to lock all the men away. But if homicide, and again, I know I'm asking sort of global questions, but I think it's important for us to figure out. Obviously, gender-based violence is prevalent all over the world, and so I'm guessing that this is happening everywhere. Is there anybody who counts homicide and maternal mortality rates in any country?
So there aren't really any other countries that track homicides as maternal mortality deaths. But the reason that it is just so much less relevant globally is because no other country in the world has as many guns as we do. And so 68% of homicides against pregnant women or new mothers involved firearms.
Okay.
So roughly, 2 in 3. And we just have so many more guns than anyone else does. And so like the risk of death by homicide for pregnant women and new mothers, like there are just so many fewer of those in other nations. And so our risk is so much more outsized, than other areas.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Although, unfortunately, men are finding plenty of ways to kill women every day.
Yes, very true.
What? So one of the things that you break down yet again in here is well, two things I want to talk about. A, the racial demographics, and B, again, the state difference, because, and again, I think it's probably a shock but not surprise thing, is that Mississippi's maternal mortality rate is double the US average. So can you talk about the difference between states and sort of what the demographic breakdown looks like for homicides?
Yes. So on a state basis, yeah. So, as we, might expect, or unfortunately, southern states have much higher maternal mortality rates, than we see, in the Pacific Northwest, the Northeast. I think actually Tennessee has the highest maternal mortality deaths in the U.S. With Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi close behind. These, rates are really because, there aren't a lot of, OBGYNs in these areas. Many of the women are living in, what's called like maternal care deserts, and so have to drive really long distances, for these areas. And when we also, break some of this down, by age group as well, we tend to see, that women generally in the US are also starting to give birth, later and later. And so we tend, are starting to see some of these, numbers, rise at much higher rates. So, that rate for people age, 35 to 39 can be 81 per 100,000, so starts to, spike again. And I think in Mississippi, this maternal mortality rate for women is basically the same as it is, for women in Libya, which is shocking and heartbreaking because, they've been in the midst of a civil war for many, many years.
They have, but we've also been in the midst of the, I think, systematic decimation of rural health. Like 10 years ago, worked for a healthcare consulting company that I hated and didn't stay out for long. But my job was to go around to hospitals, mostly rural hospitals, and help them figure out sort of issues that they were having around the fact that our hospital systems are being merged, they're being bought up by VCs, they're significantly cutting rural hospitals, all of them, or care. And it's hard to get doctors to move there. I live right now in a very rural, very small town in Arizona. It's full of seniors. So it's plenty of senior care. But, I take care of my 94-year-old grandmother. We've been in the emergency room at midnight, and there's one doctor in the emergency room after midnight, and all of the tests have to be sent an hour away to Tucson. which means that you're there all night just because they're waiting for tests. And that's just the reality of being in a really small rural area. And we've seen over the decades the significant loss of, first of all, hospitals, but also abortion care, right? And like all sorts of different things that women, pregnant women, et cetera, need. And so it's no surprise that in these poor rural areas, we see these huge maternal mortality issues. They don't have anywhere to go.
Yeah, and I think exactly as you were alluding to, the problem is likely about to get much worse as many more women, will be, bringing, pregnancies to term, because, they didn't have access, to, an abortion or, contraception. And so not only will we have many more, pregnant mothers, but also like, yeah, many more, dads who didn't want that kid to be in the world either and might become violent as a result of that. And yeah, then they aren't able to get, the care that they need. There's resent in the house. And then I think, there, you also layer on top of it the fact that for, decades, if not, centuries, Black women in America just get far worse healthcare than their, white peers. And we see that, for pregnant women, for non-pregnant women. And we also see it in the homicide data. Black pregnant women are 5 times more likely to die from homicide than white pregnant women. And Black pregnant women are 8 times more likely to die from homicide than non-pregnant Black women. And so the risk of being a pregnant Black woman in America is not what it should be at all. And
Yeah.
then in certain parts of the US, yeah, and then you like are find your, if you're in Louisiana versus New York City, that can also be like an incredibly different and painful picture.
It 100% can, but one of the things that I think uh, was really important and that helped people realize that Black women get much worse medical care and much worse obstetric care, regardless of socioeconomic status, was when both Serena Williams and Beyonce talked about how they almost died when they were giving birth and their doctors weren't listening to them. And I don't think there's no, first of all, woman who's ever been to a doctor who hasn't experienced major sexism in the hospital system. But for Black women, particularly, I mean, I know a lot of Black women who avoid going to the doctor at all. I certainly go as little as possible and have been fortunate so far to be relatively healthy because it's a pretty horrifying experience, even when you're not pregnant. So this leads me to I have a question of what is being done, but I think given the times we're in now, when our national health services are being run by a man with a worm in his brain, my question is, what changes are we already seeing or do you expect to see? Because I think that it's clear when we're looking at what's happening in the country now that this is only going to get worse because all of the factors around the reasons for maternal mortality, whether it's due to hospitals or childbirth or whatever, whether it's due to homicide, are about to exacerbate. So have you seen or do you have any predictions about what the changes that we're seeing right now in the government, how they might impact this, and also what can still be done even maybe in this moment where normal sort of policy solutions that we might seek may not be feasible?
Yeah, so I think things are going to get worse before they get better. Unfortunately, I think probably many pregnant women are going to, migrate out of, some of these states where things are worse. I think people are going to be leaving states where they might not be able to, get proper medical care. Where a woman's right to choose is getting infringed on. I think you are going to see migrations for people who have the means to make those migrations. I think for the millions or hundreds of thousands of people who don't, I think, yeah, we are going to find ourselves in a really, troubling situation, particularly as funding for a lot of these organizations is getting pulled. They are under threat. They are not supposed to be giving, different care to different populations. And so, yeah, I do worry what the next 5, 10, 15 years. Like, I don't think this is going to be a short-term challenge. I think this is going to be something that is, you know, going to stick around for a while because these organizations, these organizations that would be helping, new mothers, they take a long time to stand up. They require a lot of funding. Getting medical professionals trained just takes forever to do as well. Not to mention, that I think something like we're supposed to have like a deficit of 80,000 physicians in rural parts of the US by 2030. And so like already we're starting from behind. But on the positive side, so, every piece I publish, we put this like path forward section, right, to think about like what we can actually do for implementing change. I do think that there are some, more positive things that, are being done or can be done, right? More and more states have been tracking, the maternal mortality statistics up to 1 year, right? We're at 37 now, but that, is continuing to grow. And there are more states that are kind of debating whether or not to do that. Um, there have also been some public conversations too, as the CDC had acknowledged that it, struggled to, kind of track some of this data about how it might integrate the homicide data into its metrics. So there's this thing called the National Violent Death Reporting System. And that basically has the data that we would need in order to link the CDC data, with this, other data. So we could like be joining these things and sort of better tracking this. It's not currently happening, but like it's not technically that difficult to do. And then there are more states and more communities that are trying to do a bit more to like put some of this, intimate partner violence screening into checkups, right? Basically asking the partner to step out of the room for just a few minutes, telling them like, hey, she needs some water. Can you go get it for, even subtle ways to do it too, and starting to ask those questions. Right now, fewer than 30% of women actually gets that screening. But the more that we do that, the more then, these women who might be at higher risk, we could send, better social services or social workers or kind of care to those homes and women who need it.
Well, that's hopeful. And I love, I mean, we are seeing, we've seen an increase in maternal mortality since Dobbs, which for anyone listening who doesn't know, Hers International is the Supreme Court case that I allowed effectively ended national protection of abortion. And we have seen Texas very recently start I think they either passed or the assembly is considering changing their abortion laws to make it less restrictive because we've seen maternal mortality go up so high. And so I think that even if nationally we may not be able to get Congress to pass something, we may not be able to count necessarily on the CDC or HHS, that there are still states that we can push to change policy. In a quicker, although the Texas Assembly only meets once every 2 years, but quicker, and with a more local push, right? That a Texas state legislature has a far smaller group of constituents and voters than a senator who's representing the entire state. So I think that I see a lot of hope in the fact that there are still people really fighting and fighting for state policy change, which I think is still possible.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, particularly like yeah, as the political gridlock, deepens and the polarization increases, thinking about the role that yeah, states and counties can play in improving some of these health outcomes is important. Which is why, yeah, understanding what's going on in different states and different counties too is so important because, trying to track which areas, need this attention, who's struggling more or less, we can start to see that more and more clearly.
Yeah, I think so. And that is why I love your Substack. It does that. It does it very well for a variety of issues that we need to be learning about, but we need to be learning about in as detailed and nuanced a way as possible. I was comparing your Substack to ProPublica when I was describing it to someone. I was like, no, these are less He's
I
doing
have.
pro bono. He's doing like really good like data that you need, but like breaking it down because I'm not looking through the raw data. Like, I don't know he has time for that. You have time for that.
Yeah, I
I
find time for that. Yeah.
You find time for it. And I find time for Netflix. We all have different priorities. No, well, thank you, Jeremy. I am so glad that you wrote this. There was just so much in here that helped answer a lot of questions for me. And in good and bad ways. And as maternal mortality, and particularly Black maternal mortality, has been such a big issue for so long, and something that I have been trying to learn about and read about and talk to people about. And there just were always a lot of sort of gaps in my understanding. And these two pieces helped me understand and feel sad. But I do like that you ride the path forward. And I was like, all right, we can think positively. But thank you so much for joining and for doing that. Everyone, obviously, these articles will be linked in the show notes, and you can subscribe to American Inequality. I highly recommend it. Thank you, Jeremy, for doing this.
Thank you again, Kat.
Thanks for listening to Choose the Bear. The best way to support this podcast is to leave a review and share it with someone who might love it too. It really helps. See you next time.